Melissa Swindell began her museum career at the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of American History, where she researched colonial American foodways for the American Enterprise exhibit. Her favorite experience at the National Museum of American History was exploring the collections behind the scenes, from the inkwell that Abraham Lincoln used to sign the Emancipation Proclamation to the bongo drum that Desi Arnez played on "I Love Lucy." After this experience, she knew her mission was to show people that history is not boring and static. It's often stranger than fiction, and it can be fun and engaging for people of all ages. Melissa returned home to Georgia from Washington, D.C. with the passion and experience to bring history to life for the people visiting museums in our state. Today, she serves as the executive director of the Georgia Writers Museum, and she cannot wait to introduce readers across the state and beyond to our hometown writers.
You'll notice that I am trying to make Eatonton Georgia's literary capital and make that a thing, or make it stick, make it our slogan, if you will. So bear with me through all of the authors I'll talk to you about today, and maybe by the end I'll have convinced you to kind of go out there and be ambassadors for Eaton to be our literary capital. And definitely want to thank Robin and the Friends of the Archives for having me here today. It's already been a pleasure, and I know it's going to be even greater by the end. So you'll see here on the screen that we have 9 distinguished Georgia writers within 30 miles of the museum. So welcome in, have a seat. Since only a couple of us have been to the museum, I'll tell you a little bit about it and its history first. We were founded in 2014. Eatonton at that point had a really hard time coming back from the recession of 08, 09. The downtown area was pretty much decimated. The major industries were farming, the dairy industry. It was Georgia's dairy capital, and it no longer is. So literary capital, make it happen. Dairy capital, and then we were also in manufactured homes. Horton Homes was a major producer in the area. And so during the recession, and then of course the housing boom of that time. So a lot of the dairy farmers sold out to housing developments. There are major kind of gated communities, planned communities on this area and around the lake now. And so when the dairy farmers sold out to these housing communities, and then the bubble burst and the recession happened, they weren't developing the land. And of course, Horton Homes went out of business. And so that left most of our major industries kind of gone from Eatonton. And then following that, a change in the regulations with Georgia Power left one of the power plants to close. So really by 2014, Eatonton was struggling. And we had a group of local citizens who met with the state of Georgia's economic development team, and they said the fastest way to rebuild a small city was through tourism, and specifically tourism through the arts. So we already had a performing arts company. I think 2 more have sprouted since then. And we came up with the idea of a visual arts group and a literary arts group, because we knew, of course, and you've probably read Joel Chandler Harris, The Brer Rabbit Folk Tales, Uncle Remus from Eatonton, and Alice Walker, The Color Purple from Eatonton. So we knew we had the literary arts covered. We began a visual arts gallery and artist space. So those two kind of grew up together from 2014 forward. And about 3 years ago, we finally both branched off from our parent organization and have been standing on our own 2 feet. So we're pretty proud of that. The Artisans Village Gallery is now the largest artist guild in Middle Georgia. And Georgia Writers Museum is now seeing about 3,000 visitors a year out to Eatonton. So pretty proud of those accomplishments. It's come a long way. And then when you see here, Distinguished Georgia Writers, what that means is these are writers who have been inducted to one of 3 awards. Either they've received the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame Award from the University of Georgia at the Harvard Library. They have been received a Lifetime Achievement Award out of Georgia Writers Association from Kennesaw State University. And and/or they've received the Townsend Prize for Fiction, which is the highest award for literary fiction in the state of Georgia. That was with Georgia State University, and last year it was gifted to the Atlanta Writers Club, which is a historic Atlanta organization founded in 1914. Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind fame, was a member. And they reached out to us, and so now we co-award that. So the next one will be April of 25 for that award. So if you have won one or more of those awards, you can be into the Distinguished Writers at the Georgia Writers Museum. Oh, I should ask, any questions so far? And feel free to interrupt me as I go through this. We have, of the 9, you'll see that I have listed Joel Chandler Harris first as 0 miles from our literary epicenter. The museum is on the square in downtown Eatonton, and Joel was born just across the square on the other side of the courthouse, in a former tavern. And so I'll kind of give you a little history of each of these, and we'll dive a little deeper. Continuing in the order of distance from the museum, we have Alice Walker, who's born about 15 minutes from downtown Eatonton, in a sharecropping home, kind of more so where the farming community is. Followed by that, we have Gene Toomer, who is a Harlem Renaissance writer. He is writing in Sparta, Georgia, which is Hancock County. Then Raymond Andrews, about 20 miles away, also born in Morgan County, just outside of Madison, Georgia. Augustus B. Longstreet, who was a circuit riding judge who was in the Ocmulgee district, which was Greene County, and he lived there briefly. Followed by Philip Lee Williams, who is a contemporary author, and he is born in Morgan County, Madison, Georgia. Sidney Lanier, all of you probably know that he was born in Macon, but he is part of our 9 because when he attended school at Oglethorpe University, it was in Milledgeville at that time when the state capital was at Milledgeville. Flannery O'Connor is also in Milledgeville. She, of course, lived at the family farm Andalusia, where she wrote most of her major works, and she attended Georgia State College for Women, which is now Georgia College. And last and certainly not least, contemporary writer John T. Edge is from Clinton, Georgia, which is Jones County, and he writes about the history of food. So he's probably our most delicious author. Any questions, thoughts? Okay. All right. Who has heard about Joel Chandler Harris? Most people? Great. I love an audience who knows Joel. He and I are buds. Before my work at the Georgia Writers Museum, just for full transparency, I was the executive director of the Wren's Nest in Atlanta. Have anybody been there? Awesome. For those who don't know, the Wren's Nest is Joel's Atlanta home, but he was born in Eatonton and raised there. This is his childhood. So for me, apparently there's no escaping Joel. He and I are going to be lifelong buds. But as I said, born in Eatonton, Georgia, around 1845, to an unwed mother. You'll see Mary Harris's image here. This is a pencil-drawn sketch. It lives at the Wren's Nest. It is the only known image of Mary Harris because she did not like to have her picture taken, apparently. So that's really all we know about her. She, as a young woman, lived and worked at Barnes's Tavern, which I said was across the square in Eatonton, Georgia. And she had Joel while she was living and working there. She left her parents' home in Scandal and earned her way by cleaning and doing laundry at the tavern. The tavern is no longer standing. We know it was a wood-framed building, and it was replaced by a brick building on the square after the war. Today it is the home of a furniture store, and there's still a marker outside that says this is where Joel Chandler Harris of Brer Rabbit fame was born. So a few years after Joel was born, Mary received a new job offer. About 1 block from Barnes's Tavern and across the street was the Reed family home. And Dr. Reed had a cottage behind his house. Well, and by house, I mean a columned, antebellum mansion. And today, if you visit Eatonton, you'll recognize it as the Bronson home. It's the home to the Eatonton Putnam Historical Society. So they have preserved the house, and they tell the story of Eatonton's history. Mary and Joel lived there while she worked for the family as a seamstress and laundry maid. And in addition, Dr. Reed paid for Joel's education. So there is some speculation that Dr. Reed may have been Joel's father, but then there's 3 or 4 other theories floating out there, and nobody really knows. By the time Joel was a young teen, he started working at the Eatonton Post Office, which is pictured here, and it is I think a Georgia Archives photo, right? So when he was working here, of course, most of you are historians and have studied some history. You know that before the internet, right? You got your news in the newspaper. I have to tell when I teach this one to the children, you know, like bring a newspaper with me and show them, and it's a whole thing. But he would get the news, and after he was done making sure the mail room was swept and cleaned, and he did all the chores for the postmaster that day, he was allowed to sit and look at the newspaper. So he would sit on this old green couch that only had 3 legs, so I imagine it wobbled a little bit. And he found the ad in the newspaper for a printer's devil. Do you guys know what a printer's devil is? Ish. So when newspapers were set, and I apologize for not bringing a copy, but I think there's some in the archives, the Countryman newspaper, imagine the smallest type, like type 8, type 6 font on your computer when you go, oh man, I hit the wrong button, I need to blow that up a little bit. This is about the size that it was. And it was full pages of almost 6 to 8 type font. And he would take the pieces, the letters, and stamp them and press them onto the newspaper when a story was handed to him. So someone handwrites a story, give it to Joel, and he sets it. But he doesn't just set it as, you know, A, B, C, or, you know, whatever the story is. He has to set it backwards and in reverse, because when the print comes down, it prints on the paper in the opposite way. So that's why they called it a printer's devil, because it was a devil of a job, if you will. So Joel's at the post office. He sees the ad for the printer's devil, which is on Turnwald Plantation. And he, let's see, next slide. He goes out to Turnwald and talks to Turner about this job. So you'll see Turnwald Plantation, a kind of a modern picture up there at the top. There are historic photos here at the Georgia Archives of it, and it is beautiful. Turnwald is the first place that Joel hears the Brer Rabbit stories. When he wasn't working in the print shop, the story goes that because of the structure of the plantation class, as a child of an unwed mother and a worker on the plantation, and being white, he didn't really fit in with the plantation family per se, although he was allowed to use the library and other facilities, and he stayed with Turner, the youngest child, in the same bedroom. But as part of the plantation family, he wasn't really in the family per se. So he spent a lot of time with the enslaved people where he didn't fully fit in either, but they accepted him. And that's where he learned the stories of Brer Rabbit. So if you see the image down there at the bottom of the enslaved people standing, that is actually a photo from Turnwald Plantation just after the war. It's held in the Rose Library. So it's a kind of rare photo from the time period. But these are the men and women that Harris learned these Brer Rabbit stories from. And Harris in particular credits an enslaved man named George Terrell with sharing these stories with him. So far, I've not found any images of George. He's not one of the people standing here. But this photo here, the woman seated, is George's granddaughter. So Harris worked for the paper and worked for the Turnwald during the Civil War. And following that, he moved around Georgia and worked for a handful of papers. I know he worked in Monroe for a little while, Walton County. But in 1876, Harris went to work for the Atlanta Constitution, and he told the Brer Rabbit stories in serial until he published his first completed works in 1881. The illustration on the cover that you can see a little bit there is by A.B. Frost. And Harris took Frost to Putnam County because he wanted him to really kind of see and engage with the landscape and the people and the animals that were the backdrop for these Brer Rabbit folktales. Harris wanted everything to be as authentic to his childhood memories as possible when he both wrote and had the book illustrated. And before Frost came along, he had fired a number of illustrators up to that point. But in total, Harris wrote 35 books and spent 2 years publishing a nationally syndicated magazine, the Uncle Remus Home magazine, just prior to his death in 1908. And then 3 decades later, in the 1940s, the Wren's Nest, as a nonprofit, and side note, it's the oldest historic house museum in the state. Their nonprofit organization sold the rights of Brer Rabbit to Walt Disney, which is where you get Song of the South. Any questions I can answer about Joel? All right. So next up, of course, in order of distance, we have Alice Walker. She is the 8th and final child born to Willie and Minnie Walker, who were sharecroppers in Putnam County. Alice's story of writing and literature really come into play when she's about 8 years old. At that point, they were playing outside, and her brother accidentally shot her in the eye with a BB gun. When this happened, it was 1952, and when you're looking at this picture of their house, the back is to a major road, Ward's Chapel Road. And her father took her to the road because they didn't have a car and flagged down cars and said, "My daughter's been shot. I need to take her to a doctor." Nobody would stop. So this accident, it left Alice partially blind in one eye. And then because of it, the physical scarring, she retreated kind of into her own world and into books. She just started reading and writing significantly at this point and was eventually named valedictorian of her high school class in Eatonton at Butler Baker High School. She left Putnam in 1962 for Spelman College in Atlanta. She studied there for 2 years and then transferred to Sarah Lawrence in New York. During her college years, she worked on her writing skills, of course, and became an active member of the civil rights movement. So after graduation, Alice moved to Jackson, Mississippi to work for the civil rights movement. She assisted in a law office that aided in African-American voters getting registered to vote and being able to vote once registered. In the law office was a young law student from NYU, Mel Leventhal. They fell in love. They returned to New York for Mel to finish his law degree, and they married in New York because in 1967 in Mississippi, interracial marriages were still illegal. So when they came back to Jackson after he had graduated to continue working in the civil rights movement, this is the picture of the house that they both lived in together. The following years after returning and living in this home were dark years for Alice. MLK was assassinated, and of course she attended the funeral. And in the same year, she miscarried trying to have a child. Finally, in 1969, Alice and Mel welcomed their only child, a daughter, Rebecca. And 7 years later, 1976, Alice and Mel divorced, and Alice moved to California, where she currently lives. And in 1982, Alice published her most notable work, The Color Purple. Of course, you all know it won a Pulitzer Prize the following year, and then 2 years following that, Steven Spielberg directed the film adaptation featuring Whoopi Goldberg and Oprah Winfrey, and Alice spent a significant time on that set, helping kind of inform the creative of the movie. The movie premiered at Eatonton's Peck's Theater, which the original theater here is pictured here. The theater is still in Eatonton today. It's about 4 doors down from the museum on the same block, and they are in the process of renovating the theater and bringing it back to life. They did a premiere here in They did a premiere in Eatonton. Alice's mother, Minnie, at that point was too old and in too poor of health to be able to travel, and Alice wanted to ensure that her mother would be able to see the movie. And then in 2019, Alice returned to Eatonton for the first time in 3 decades. Her memories of racial segregation in the South and the way that Eatonton had treated her and Putnam County residents had treated her were just horribly negative. And so she didn't return until her 75th birthday. The museum and other organizations in the area hosted this birthday for her. And this is a hard picture to see, but Alice is sitting on the left, and Valerie Boyd, who is now also Georgia Writers Hall of Fame inductee and well-respected author in her own right, is interviewing her. And together they published this book, Gathering Blossoms Under Fire. It's the Journals of Alice Walker, and it came out last spring. Any questions about Alice? All right. We'll go on to Jean. Anybody know who Jean Toomer was? No? Has anybody read the novel Cain? All right, one person in the room. Awesome. So Toomer, pictured here, was born in 1894 in Washington, D.C. So don't worry, we'll get to why he's a Georgia Writers. His father, Nathan Toomer, was a freed man. He was formerly enslaved. He was a farmer from Georgia, and he was the widower. So he married, and his wife died. His first wife died. His widow was Amanda America Dixon Toomer of Hancock County, Georgia. She was a slave-born Georgia plantation heiress, which is a mouthful, but so strange, right? So do a quick side note about Amanda, because you can't mention that and just leave it hanging there. Amanda was the child of an enslaved woman and the white plantation owner. And unlike many stories of this happening, her father loved her, and she was daddy's girl, basically. So they lived in Augusta. When her father passed away, he left the entire estate to Amanda. And of course, this did not go over well with her full white siblings. They took her through the Georgia Supreme Court, which eventually ruled in her favor that she was to inherit all of his property and his estate. And the ruling made her one of the wealthiest women in 19th century America. Jean is not directly related to Amanda. It's his father's first wife, but the racial controversy and reckoning that surrounded that really came to mark Toomer's life and who he was and how he fit into the social classes and racial classes in this world. Now, Toomer's mother is also fascinating. Nina Pinchback Toomer was the daughter of a mixed-race Louisiana governor, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, that's a full name, and he was the first African-American to serve as the governor of any U.S. state. So he has kind of a lot to think about as far as race and status go. At 13 years old, Jean went to live with his maternal grandmother, still in Washington, D.C. His mother passed away in 1909, and just at his birth, his father had returned to Georgia. So primarily raised by his mother until he was about 12 or 15. Toomer went on to he graduated high school. He went on to attend college at the University of Wisconsin and the College of the City of New York, and did not graduate from either university. He then spent 4 years writing and publishing, and finally accepted a temporary substitute principal job in 1921 at the Sparta Agricultural Institute in Hancock County, Georgia, which is what you see here. The rural middle Georgia countryside is near where he knew his father had spent many years. And so although Toomer only spent about 8 weeks in Sparta, the result is his novel Cain, and it changed his life in the literary world. So in Sparta, and I have a couple of quotes here. In Sparta, Toomer proclaimed he discovered in an African-American soul a seed of his own blood that had been obscured by his own ambiguous racial upbringing. He felt that the Black community he met in Sparta still showed the signs of an African American spirit that he saw dying out in urbanized America. Previously frustrated in his search for a meaningful life and meaningful subject, Toomer found that he overflowed with stories and poetry inspired by this Georgia landscape, the African American voices, and the interracial encounters of the Southern Blacks and whites that he met in the Jim Crow era agricultural town. His 1923 novel, Cain, was the result. The townspeople and surroundings of Sparta, Georgia that inspired Toomer helped him create the fictional community of Sumter, in which the story of Cain takes place. After Cain's widespread reception and Toomer's seemingly successful search for his paternal roots, he launched what I would call a 1920s eat, pray, love sort of journey. He began studying under the Russian mystic psychologist 𝐺𝑒𝑜𝑣𝑒, who was living in France. He then traveled to India in 1939. He later delved into Jungian psychology, and for a time he followed psychic Edgar Cayce's teachings. Then he turned to the Church of Scientology, and if that's not enough, by 1940, he joined the Quakers, where he seemed to settle spiritually until he died in Pennsylvania in 1967. Questions? I'm not sure I can answer them. It's he's just as confusing as he sounds, but it is a remarkable book. So Raymond Andrews, he is the fourth of 10 children, born to George and Viola Perryman Andrews, just outside of Madison, Georgia. Andrews' parents were sharecroppers, and he and his siblings worked alongside them in Morgan County in the cotton fields and in the peach orchards. He and his brothers and sisters attended a segregated school. The arts were extremely important to his parents, reading, writing, and visual arts. His father was a great visual folk artist. And his parents kind of instilled this into their children, despite the economic and socio-political limitations of the time. At 15 years old, Andrews followed his oldest brother, Benny, to Atlanta. Together, Ray and Benny lived at the Butler Street YMCA and attended Booker T. Washington High School. Raymond worked as a hospital orderly during the day and finished his high school classes at night. Following his diploma, he served in the Air Force during the Korean War, and then coming back from a tour of duty, he ended up spending about a year or so at Michigan State University, but decided to leave college to pursue writing. So during the day, he moved to New York City and he worked as an airline reservation agent for KLM and then wrote in the evenings. In 1966, he published his first writing that was nationally syndicated. It ended up in Sports Illustrated. It was titled A Football Rebellion in Backwoods, Georgia. And it talks about two different football teams and race relations in small town Georgia. When he learned the news of this being picked up and published in Sports Illustrated, he immediately walked off of his airline job and started writing full time. So the story goes. Andrews' first novel, Appalachia Red, won the James Baldwin Prize for Fiction in 1978. And this trilogy of these three books here tell the story of a Black man who changes everything for African Americans in the small town of Appalachia, which is based on his hometown of Madison, Georgia. In 1984, Andrews moved closer to Athens, Georgia, and published a memoir titled The Last Radio Baby. The novel describes his childhood years when his family lived on the same property with their Black grandmother and white grandfather. And if you see here, Roosevelt Lee, Wildcat, Tennessee, supposedly that was his grandmother's name. She claimed that she was part African, part Native American. So that's what they called her. I think it's a fascinating name. Ray was the ultimate starving artist. He produced works of literary merit that entered him into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame posthumously, but with a series of publishers that eventually all of his books went out of print. This, complicated by financial and emotional struggles between he and his brother Benny Andrews. Ray died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound near Athens, November 25th, 1991. His brother Benny is a renowned artist, visual artist, followed in his father's footsteps in some ways, and his work is at the Guggenheim and other very notable art museums. All right, Augustus B. Longstreet. I think we've got about 3 more authors, but I wasn't keeping count, so maybe you were. Augustus is perhaps the oldest writer I'll talk about today. He was born in Augusta in 1790, just 7 years after American independence. And he's the oldest author in all of our distinguished writers. So he attended Yale University in 1811. And, quote, while in college, Longstreet regaled his teachers and fellow students with stories that he would later publish in his book, Georgia Scenes. I'll come back to his writing in just a minute. I'll tell you a little bit more about him first. In 1821, Longstreet joined the Georgia legislature, and he had very strong future political ambitions, but his career was cut short just 3 years later with the death of his son. Longstreet withdrew his candidacy for Congress and withdrew into his family, beginning to seek religion for solace. In 1827, Longstreet formally joined the Methodist Church, and this seemed to help, and in 1835, I should say, he published a series of stories he collected from his youth and from his early career days as a circuit attorney on the Ocmulgee Circuit, which is around middle Georgia, kind of Greene and Putnam counties, if you think where the Ocmulgee River area is. He described his own work as able to, quote, supply a chasm in history which has always been overlooked, the manners, customs, amusements, wit, dialect as they appear in all grades of society to an ear and eye witness of them. More simply, Longstreet recorded everyday people doing everyday things in the South, Georgia in particular, and this was during the early years of the new republic, 1783 to 1800. So this type of writing and the spotlight on history, however humorous, gives historians a sense of the way that people lived and interacted in that time. And I have included a drawing from Georgia Scenes here. The formal title of Georgia Scenes is Georgia Scenes, Characters, Incidents, etc. in the first half of the century of the Republic. The Longstreet's caption on this one is hurrying to the race. So, you know, that's the humor of the 1700s. This is a typical humor throughout his book and typical portrait or illustrations. In 1838, and I should mention that this book, Georgia Scenes, is really the first book of literature to come out of the state of Georgia, which is one of the reasons he has been inducted into the Hall of Fame. In 1838, Longstreet was accepted into the Methodist ministry, and within a year, he became the second president of Emory College at Oxford. He soon rejects Georgia Scenes as too trivial for a man of his standing. And this is a portrait of him, so you could see that maybe he would think this was too trivial at that point. In 1844, Longstreet, along with the president of the Board of Trustees for Emory College, Bishop Andrews, attend the Methodist Episcopal Church's National Conference in New York City. At the conference, Bishop Andrews is an owner of slaves, and it prompted a month-long debate for his fitness in office at the Methodist Church. The church ultimately divided over the issue, which is where you get Southern Methodists and Northern Methodists before you have today the United Methodist Church, I guess for a little while now, but that's a different topic. Longstreet was in the middle of this debate, firmly on Bishop Andrews' side and that of the slave-owning South. In 1847, Longstreet published a series of pro-slavery letters titled A Voice from the South. For 2 more years, he continued at the helm of Emory College until transferring to Century College in Louisiana in 1949, University of Mississippi in 1850, and finally to South Carolina College in 1856. As the Civil War loomed closer each year, and despite being an ardent defender of states' rights, Longstreet began to have doubts about succession. And in 1859, he published Shall South Carolina Begin the War? When the war did eventually break out, Longstreet was 71 years old. He returned to Mississippi to be near his daughter and passed away in 1870. Philip Lee Williams. Anybody read his books? He's a contemporary writer. Okay, awesome. Philip Lee Williams' family moved to Madison, Georgia when he was 3 years old, Morgan County. He graduated from Morgan County High School and received a journalism degree from the University of Georgia in 1972. As an undergraduate, Williams began his literary career publishing poetry in magazines and began producing music. Williams has since published poetry in more than 50 magazines and has composed a number of symphonies, chamber works, concerti, and church music. And he works as a documentary film writer and co-producer. He's best known for his novels, which bring him into the Writers' Hall of Fame. This makes up 2/3 of his 15 books, all set in his native South and more often than not centered on Georgia characters and settings. His most recent novel, number 13, was published last year entitled Far Beyond the Gates. Working to expand the exhibits at GWM, or Georgia Writers Museum, we're in the process of collecting artifacts from all of these Hall of Fame writers. Here on the left, you can see a painting by Philip Lee Williams, and on the right, a copy of one volume of literature, or one volume of the literary journal he and his would-be wife published while attending UGA as graduate students. In addition to these works, we've collected from Philip Lee Williams a typewriter, numerous awards, and are working with him now to collect a copy of a symphony that he penned for the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra. For us, Philip Lee Williams is a true Renaissance man, and it's been a lot of fun to work with him. Sidney Lanier, born in Macon, as I mentioned earlier, February 3rd, 1842. He was the oldest son of Colonel Robert Sampson Lanier of Athens, Georgia, and Mary Jane Anderson. In 1858, Sidney began college as a 15-year-old sophomore at Oglethorpe University. Pretty impressive for, thought so. At that time, Oglethorpe was located in Midway, Georgia, about 2 miles south of the then capital at Milledgeville. He roomed in the dorms at Thalian Hall, which is pictured here, along with his dorm room, which looks very different than my dorm room in college. In his first year, he was elected as the youngest president of the Thalian Society, a secret literary and debating fraternity. And just 2 years into college in 1860, Sidney enlisted alongside his brother as a private in the Signal Corps of Macon's 2nd Georgia Battalion of Infantry, a volunteer regiment previously band together from the Mexican-American War. Sidney served the length of the Civil War, and in the final year, from November 64 through February 65, he had been captured and imprisoned at Point Lookout in Maryland. At the prison, he contracted tuberculosis, and the effects plagued him for the rest of his life. After the war, Sidney moved from one job to the next. He was passionate about poetry and music, but instead found jobs that did not suit his artistic talents. I like to think of Sidney Lanier as the hopeless romantic, kind of ever studying and writing poetry and music and just a little woohoo, if you will. He first worked in his grandfather's hotel, the Seven Gables in Tennessee, where he wrote his only novel, Tiger Lilies, which is pictured up there at the top. The novel is divided into 2 parts. The first is about Sidney's time at the Seven Gables Hotel, and the sections include authentic regional dialect that he remembered from his childhood working in the Macon post office. The second half of the novel, completely different. It's written in the aftermath of the Civil War, and it carries a strong anti-war theme and gruesome accounts of the war. Following his time at the Seven Gables Hotel, Sidney worked in his father's law office in Macon. He took a principalship at the Prattville Academy in Alabama, and he served as the organist for the Prattville Church. Eventually, he left the South for warmer and drier climates to relieve the lingering health issues of the tuberculosis. And then he moved to New Orleans, Galveston, Houston, Austin, and finally San Antonio. All while his wife, Mary Day Lanier, lived in this house. At some point, They are exchanging letters throughout his journey through the warmer, drier climates. And she wrote to him, and quote, "Sidney, what is your profession? Please tell me, for indeed I do not know." I'm not sure he knew either. Visiting friends in New York, Sidney met conductor Hamrick, who was in the process of forming the Peabody Orchestra in Baltimore, Maryland. When Hamrick heard Sidney play the flute, he immediately gave him for the position of first flautist at his new orchestra. Sidney earned $125 a week in Baltimore and lectured in literature at Johns Hopkins University until his untimely death at 39 years old. Last year, Georgia Writers Museum, working with the historic Macon Foundation and Wesleyan College, was able to acquire a robust collection of Sidney Lanier's artifacts. Pictured here, there you go, is a copy of his novel Tiger Lily, slightly bigger than the last one. It's the only novel-length work that he wrote, and also his portable writing desk, the one from which he traveled across the country and wrote his letters. Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, the sepia tone image there is a photograph of Sidney's father's law office in Macon. And in the back of the photo, where the arrow is, you can see a desk that's piled high with books and paper. Georgia Writers Museum now has that desk in our collections. So it's very cool to see it kind of in person and in real life. We also have 3 of Sidney's flutes from his lifetime in our collection as well. All right, moving on to Flannery. Many of you read Flannery O'Connor? People either love her or hate her work. There's not really a gray zone with Flannery. Mary Flannery was born March 25th, 1925 in Savannah, Georgia. It's a picture of her childhood home here in the center. She was the only child of Edward Francis and Regina Klein O'Connor. In the fall of 1940, Mary Flannery and her mother moved to Milledgeville. She attended Georgia State College for Women, which is now Georgia College, and she served on the student newspaper, The Colonnade. During her college days, she was best known for her cartoon work, which you can see there, an example of. In 1945, during her last year at Georgia State College for Women, Flannery was the art director of the school newspaper, the editor-in-chief of the school's literary magazine, The Corinthian, and a feature editor for the yearbook, The Spectrum. After graduation, Flannery enrolled in the University of Iowa's writing workshop. She completed her thesis in 1947, and with a collection of short stories entitled The Geranium. In June of 1948, she received an invitation to join the renowned artist community at 𝐸𝑎𝑡𝑜 in Sarasota Springs, New York. 2 years later, she was diagnosed with lupus. It was the same incurable autoimmune disease that had taken her father at a young age. And at that time, the only treatment was the use of steroids, which made her face appear swollen, as shown in this photo taken in 1952. I don't know how many photos you've seen of Flannery, but she always kind of has these roundish cheeks, almost like a chipmunk, if you will. But that is all the steroids that she was taking for lupus, and she hated the portraits of herself in those years. Flannery returned to Milledgeville, Georgia. She moved in with her mother, Regina, at the family home at Andalusia, which is pictured here. On a side note, they have just renovated this building and added a new museum interpretation gallery, and it is beautiful, and they have many more artifacts on display. So if you have a chance to get out our way, come see us and them. We're about 20 minutes apart. Yeah. Flannery, despite her suffering from the debilitating effects and the treatment of lupus, she maintained a writing regimen of at least 3 hours a day or 3 pages every morning after her 7 a.m. Mass at Sacred Heart Church. In 1964, after a surgery for a fibroid tumor, O'Connor's lupus reactivated, and her health worsened during the following months. On August 3rd, 1964, after several days in a coma, she passed away at Baldwin County Hospital and is buried beside her father at Memory Hill Cemetery in Milledgeville. Flannery is famous for her use of the Southern Gothic style, in which the stories are set in the South around violent situations with grotesque characters. Before she passed away, she authored 2 novels and 32 short stories. All right, I think this is 9th author of 9, so you've almost made it. John T. Edge was born in Clinton, Georgia, which is Jones County. His childhood home is pictured here, and it's marked with a Georgia State historical marker, not for his birthplace, but for the Confederate Brigadier General Alfred Ivinson, who was born in Edge's historic home in 1829. The legacy may be why Edge earned degrees in Southern Studies from the University of Mississippi. Edge writes about his own Southern experience, quote, "I was embarrassed deeply and profoundly to be from the South, and I loved my place and was proud as could be of some of the cultural creations the South and the people I knew. And I showed up to work to try to resolve those 2 things." At Ole Miss, Edge studied the intersections between Southern history and Southern food. For his thesis, Edge wrote about a 1931 debate in the Atlanta Constitution in the editorial pages, a food fight that erupted when editor Julian Harris, oldest son of Joel Chandler Harris, and Louisiana Governor Huey Long had different opinions about whether to dunk or crumble cornbread in the pot liquor. In the midst of his graduate studies, Edge organized the first Southern Foodway Symposium, and soon afterward, the Southern Foodway Alliance, which is dedicated to the documentation and celebration of the diverse food cultures of the American South, was founded. Since then, Edge has written and/or edited more than a dozen books, including a Foodways volume for the New Encyclopedia of Southern Culture, and his latest book, The Potlicker Papers, A Food History of the Modern South. And I've been with the Georgia Writers Museum about 3 years now, and to me it is still incredible how many accomplished writers we have in Middle Georgia, let alone the entire state. And we'll continue to share their stories and the fun ways you can engage with them. We have our website here on the QR code, and then, of course, our social media pages. But perhaps I have convinced you all that Eatonton is Georgia's literary capital at this point. Thank you all so much. Can I answer any questions for you guys? Yes.
2 questions. Did I mishear you that $139 a week?
$125 a week for Sydney Lanier to be the first flautist at Peabody and to teach literature in Hopkins.
I mean, I just went to Google, how much is that in today's money? I mean, I can't even.
I have not Googled that.
I can't even imagine there was that much money for a whole orchestra.
Right.
And how did, what are the qualifications for Hall of Fame?
So there's the Hall of Fame, and the nomination form and the induction are on the University of Georgia's website. Each organization has their own kind of criteria, and so you'll have to go to UGA, Kennesaw, or the Atlanta Writers Club to find out.
Obviously, you don't have to be retired or dead.
Correct. In fact, we'd love to honor people who are alive. It makes the party better.
Favorite item?
That is a great question. Off the top of my head, I think one of my favorite, not specifically because of the item, but because of the story behind it. We're in the process of renovating the museum so that each of these 9 authors really has a showcase to tell their story, more about their lives than about their works. And in the process of collecting these artifacts, we have gone all over the state, out of state for people who have moved, and have just been tracking lead after lead, almost like a private investigator. Really could be in a TV show at some point, but that's a whole other topic. The artifact I think has the best story I mentioned Alice Walker, when she was 8 years old, was shot in the eye by a BB gun. As a late teenager, before she graduated high school, her oldest brother was an adult and married. She was the youngest of 8 children, so he was significantly older. He had moved away to Boston and was living and working up there. And because of the racial segregation in the South, she wasn't able to find a doctor willing to take her on to help correct her eye. So he sent for her, and she went up to Boston, and she had surgery. It didn't fully correct the blindness, but it removed a lot of the scar tissue, so that she was able to look more normal and kind of feel a little bit more confident about her appearance. And in the process, the doctor is Dr. Morris Henry, who's the eye surgeon performing this. And he walks in the room and introduces himself to Alice. They have a whole conversation. I am Morris Henry. I'm the doctor. She goes, I can remember that. I love the O. Henry stories. She clearly hadn't heard him correctly. And he didn't have the heart to tell her at 16 years old or so that that wasn't his name. Later on, of course, she finds out, but we were able to track down Dr. Henry, who is in his mid-90s at this point, of course, retired and living in Arkansas. And he still had the surgical instruments that he used to perform the surgery on Alice. So he sent us those for the collection and to put on exhibit, along with some photographs that he had of he and his nursing staff from that era. So I think that's one of the best stories we have. Right. Yes, definitely.
So I guess it.
Yes, they're outside the 30-mile radius.
Raymond Andrews stuff I'd like to talk with you about.
Wonderful. Here's my card. I'll give you my cell phone number. Yes, please call me in. Let's talk about it. We've been having trouble finding much about Raymond. We have some replica items of things that we know he owned, but as one of my board members who helps curate everything, Raymond more or less seemed to erase his life right before he passed. So a lot of the family doesn't have anything, and so it's just been hard.
I have, I think I have an unpublished manuscript.
Oh, that would be incredible.
And back, we arranged the publication of Once Upon a Time in Atlanta.
Okay.
And in doing, yeah, the college did.
Mhm.
And in doing so, we visited Benny
Okay.
in New York.
Sure.
And we were actually looking for that manuscript that was considered a lost manuscript.
Okay.
And spent an evening there just asking Benny to go through his files and look for things.
Mhm.
And he brought out, just lots of Raymond's papers that he had,
Okay.
including a copy of that Sports Illustrated document you mentioned, because I recognize it.
Sure.
And my colleague and I were just reading everything that he brought out, looking for that particular manuscript. And then we had him we made copies of a few things,
Sure.
and one of them was a manuscript about 300 pages called 99 Years and a Hard Day,
Okay.
which I read.
Yeah.
It's basically a novel. I also have a copy of the illustrations that were made for that book, and I'm just trying to figure out what to do with this stuff.
Robin, don't listen. Get her to the phone. Robin will fight me for it. But yes, let's definitely talk kind of after this, because we are looking for artifacts to make sure that people understand who all these people are and the impact that they had in the literary world. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know what the date of that Sports Illustrated was.
In the 70s. I want to say 76. Let me see if I wrote it down. Raymond Andrews wrote the article, 66, I'm sorry. And it was titled A Football Rebellion in Backwoods, Georgia. And now it's not in, we found that it's not in every Sports Illustrated because they had regional production. And so it's published in the Sports Illustrated that was regionally syndicated to the South.
Which teams were they?
I think they were fictional teams, if I'm not mistaken. You may remember better than I do, but it was more of a kind of literary look into a small Georgia town, based on probably the teams in the Madison, Georgia area. Oh, okay, yeah, Tony's great. 19 of green.
Yeah.
Any other questions I can answer? Well, I have some extra business cards up here. If you all want to come visit or just get in touch with me about something, please feel free.
Your museum is open on Saturdays?
Right now we are closed, for renovations. But we will be hopefully back open early fall, September-ish. It's my goal. And we are still doing all of our events and all of our programming. Let's see, I think next week we have a Georgia Writers Hall of Fame Zoom book club meeting. And that is, I think we're reading Alice Walker's Meridian for that one. The Flannery O'Connor book club is starting back up. We took a little bit of break for the summer. And we have a Meet the Author event Tuesday night with Lynn Cullen. She wrote The Woman with the Cure about the female doctor in the 50s who founded the cure polio vaccine. So lots still going on. If you check our website, we have.
Yeah, most of my other teachers I work with will do some of the weekends, so sometimes
Yeah.
fall on Saturday. It's probably so.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely take a look because we're still definitely doing programming and keeping things out of the public.
Say I knew that they were closed for renovations, but I get the emails with all of the
Oh,
events
thank you.
that you guys are doing, and they all look amazing and fascinating.
Yes,
So,
I've seen.
yeah, thank you so much.
And you can sign up for our newsletter. It's on the very bottom of our homepage. If you just scroll all the way down, you'll get all the updates.
Thank you, Melissa. That was amazing. Thank you.